Ever heard of a countess so ruthless, she earned the nickname the Blood Countess?
Oh yeah, Elizabeth Báthory. She's quite a character in history.
And she's the focus of today's deep dive. Our listeners sent in some really fascinating stuff. Historical accounts, podcasts, even a movie trailer.
A movie trailer, huh? Sounds a bit dramatic.
Oh, it is. But it highlights how Bathory's story has transcended history and become, well, a legend. So today, we're going to try and sift through the myth and find out what we can about the real Elizabeth.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, isn't it? Separating fact from fiction.
Exactly. Especially since her story is set in 16th century Hungary, a time and place where political turmoil was, like, the norm. Constant battles with the Ottoman Empire, social tensions, you name it.
Right, and Elizabeth was smack dab in the middle of it all, part of a powerful noble family. Actually, she was related to royalty.
Oh, come on, really? Spill the tea.
Her niece was the King of Poland, and her nephew ruled Transylvania.
Wow, talk about connections. No wonder she's described as a woman who wielded significant power.
Absolutely, and that's important to keep in mind when we look at how she went from being a powerful noblewoman to being labeled, well, history's most prolific female serial killer.
Okay, now that's a huge leap. Are you suggesting those power struggles and political tensions we mentioned played a part in her downfall?
It's definitely a factor to consider. Think about it. Her nephew, the ruler of Transylvania, was in a pretty heated conflict with the Palatine of Hungary.
The Palatine. Remind me who that is again.
Basically, the highest-ranking official in the land, kind of like a prime minister.
Oh, right, right. So Elizabeth's nephew was feuding with someone who had a lot of authority.
Yeah, and guess who led the investigation into the accusations against Elizabeth?
Don't tell me. The Palatine himself.
Bingo. Gregory Thurzo. Makes you wonder, right?
For sure. Investigating your rival's aunt. It's a bit suspicious.
And it doesn't stop there. Several members of the Báthory family experienced misfortune around the same time. Her nephew faced an assassination attempt, and another relative was imprisoned in Prague.
Wow. That's a lot of bad luck for one family.
You start to see a pattern, don't you? Makes you think it wasn't just coincidence.
I see where you're going with this. Okay,
Yeah.
so we've got political intrigue, power grabs, maybe even some jealousy thrown in. It's like a real-life Game of Thrones. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, what about Elizabeth's early life? I read some stories about epilepsy, a secret love child, even witnessing brutal torture as a kid. Any truth to those?
Those stories are more like whispers than facts. They pop up in these dramatic biographies, the ones that love a good scandal, but they're not backed up by solid evidence.
Gotcha. So like a juicy rumor that got blown out of proportion over time.
That's a good way to put it. Like that claim about the secret child, the only source for that is a biography written by, get this, a surrealist poet.
Okay, that doesn't sound like a reliable historical source.
Not really. It highlights how we need to be careful with the sources we rely on.
All right, let's shift focus then. What about the actual accusations against Elizabeth? That's when things get really dark and bloody.
Right. So the investigation was, as we said, spearheaded by the Palatine, Gregory Thurzo. And he claimed to have witnessed a pretty shocking scene. Elizabeth covered in blood, apparently torturing a servant girl.
Whoa, hold on. Like he just walked down her in the act.
That's what he says. But even some accounts of his arrival sound a little over the top, like a scene from a horror movie.
Oh, come on. How so?
There's talk of Elizabeth screeching outrageously and like demonic laughter in the background. It all seems a bit, staged.
Hey, Trent, that does sound a bit too dramatic.
And even if we put that aside, the witness testimonies were all over the place. Some claimed they saw bodies being removed from the castle, while others admitted they were just repeating rumors.
So basically, gossip.
Yeah, pretty much. Not the most reliable evidence.
Agreed. And the descriptions of the torture methods, I don't even know where to begin.
It's a mixed bag. Some mentioned beatings and piercings, which were sadly not uncommon back then. But then you have these more elaborate and questionable descriptions. Like one story talks about Elizabeth smearing honey on a girl and leaving her outside for insects to bite.
Okay, that's just cruel and bizarre.
Right. It almost feels like they were trying to make her seem like a monster by any means necessary. Pile on as many horrific acts as possible.
Maybe they thought the more gruesome the story, the more believable it would be.
Possibly. And speaking of gruesome, we have to talk about the number that's always associated with Elizabeth. 650.
Ah, yes. The alleged number of her victims. That's what really cemented her reputation.
But here's the thing. That number comes from one single unnamed witness.
Really, just one person's worth.
Yep. A woman named Susanna. And get this, The number of supposed victims kept growing throughout the investigation. First it was 37, then 50, then 175. You get the picture.
It's like they were adding victims as they went along, so maybe the real number is much lower.
Or even completely fabricated. Which brings us to the big question. Why? Why would anyone accuse Elizabeth of such horrific crimes?
Well, we've talked about the political motives, but what about the legend? Was she really obsessed with staying young, bathing in blood to preserve her beauty?
That's the classic image, isn't it? But here's the catch. None of the sources from Elizabeth's time actually mention bloodbaths.
Wait, what? You're telling me that whole thing was made up later?
It appears so. That detail doesn't pop up until over 100 years after Elizabeth's death.
Wow. Talk about a game of historical telephone. So if the bloodbaths are a fabrication, what does that tell us about the accusations against Elizabeth?
It makes you wonder if the whole story was exaggerated, to say the least. Remember all that political intrigue? Imagine this. A powerful woman who was a threat to ambitious men. Accusing her of monstrous acts would be a perfect way to discredit her, seize her land, and grab her wealth.
Now, that's a thought-provoking theory. Makes you see Elizabeth in a whole new light, right?
Absolutely. But before we get too carried away, we need to talk about the reality of torture in 16th century Hungary. Even if Elizabeth wasn't the bloodthirsty monster she's often portrayed as, torture was very real and very brutal.
Okay, yeah, that's a point we can't ignore. This is where things get even more unsettling, right?
Right. So we're talking about Elizabeth's possible motives and the political climate at the time.
Yeah, trying to sort through what's real and what's been exaggerated.
Exactly. It's a messy picture. But one thing we know for sure is that Elizabeth died of natural causes in 1614, 4 years after being placed under house arrest.
Okay, but wouldn't a woman accused of such heinous crimes face a harsher punishment? I mean, death row, a public execution, something like that?
Well, she was confined to her castle, but it wasn't really a harsh imprisonment. She had servants, could write letters. She even wrote her will and divided up her property among her children.
That's interesting. That doesn't sound like someone considered a bloodthirsty serial killer.
Right. It lends some weight to the idea that the accusations were more about politics than actual justice. By keeping her alive but under their control, her enemies could neutralize her power without, the fallout of a public execution.
Makes sense. But what about her servants? Didn't they get caught up in all of this too?
Sadly, yes. Her servants weren't so lucky. 3 of them, all women, were found guilty and executed.
Oh, that's awful. What happened to them?
1 was beheaded, and the other 2 had their fingers burned off before being burned alive at the stake.
That's horrific. Talk about a miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, it really highlights the power dynamics at play back then. Servants, especially women, had very little protection against accusations from those above them.
And their confessions, even if they were coerced, were used against Elizabeth, while she remained somewhat protected by her status.
Exactly.
It really makes you think about those witness testimonies and how reliable they actually were. I mean, were they speaking the truth, or were they just saying what they thought their accusers wanted to hear? Especially under threat of torture.
That's a tough question to answer definitively. We know that torture was pretty standard practice in court cases back then, so it's highly likely that Elizabeth's servants were forced to confess, regardless of whether they were actually guilty.
Wow, that's pretty disturbing. It adds a whole new level of darkness to the story.
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe this isn't just about political maneuvering and slander, but a whole system designed to extract confessions, regardless of truth.
Right. The ends justify the means, as they say.
Unfortunately, that seems to be the case here.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about how Elizabeth went from being a controversial figure to the infamous Blood Countess. Like, where did that whole legend come from?
Well, that's where the power of storytelling comes in. Over time, Elizabeth's story got, embellished, exaggerated. People filled in the blanks with speculation and, let's be honest, a lot of sensationalism.
Right, because there weren't many reliable records, especially about her personal life, so people could basically make things up.
Exactly. And the image of a beautiful woman using blood to stay young, well, that's a pretty potent image. It played into all those anxieties about female vanity and the lengths women would go to for beauty.
It's like a twisted fairy tale.
Yeah, and don't forget about the cultural obsession with witchcraft and the occult back then. Elizabeth's story got mixed up with those fears too, making her seem even more monstrous.
It's like she became the embodiment of everything society feared about women: powerful, defiant, and maybe even dabbling in dark magic.
That's a great way to put it. She became a symbol of female power gone wrong.
Okay, so we've talked about the accusations, the political context, and the legend. But what about Elizabeth, the person? I mean, is there anything we know about her that isn't completely overshadowed by all the blood and horror?
It's hard to say for sure. Separating fact from fiction is incredibly difficult with someone like her. But there are some things that offer a different perspective.
Like what?
We have some letters Elizabeth wrote to her husband, family members, that sort of thing. And those letters show a woman who was intelligent, capable, and, actively involved in running her estates.
So not a crazed, bloodthirsty maniac.
Not exactly. She seems quite level-headed in her writing. Pragmatic, even.
Interesting. And wasn't she a pretty devout Lutheran?
Yes, she was. That often gets overlooked in the more sensationalized versions of her story. But her religious beliefs were well documented. She even had a chapel built in her castle.
So we have a woman who was deeply religious, capable of managing large estates, and maintained relationships with her family. That's a completely different picture from the blood countess we usually hear about.
It is. And it reminds us that historical figures were real people, not just characters in a horror story.
Right. It's easy to forget that. This whole deep dive is really showing how history can be distorted and twisted to fit a certain narrative.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder how many other stories we believe are based on, well, shaky ground.
That's a chilling thought.
Hmm.
So what else should we explore about Elizabeth's story? What haven't we covered yet?
Let's talk about the torture chamber. It's a frequent element of the Elizabeth Báthory legend, but we need to understand the reality of torture in her time to see how it fits or doesn't fit with her story.
Okay, yeah. This is where things get a bit more gruesome. But it's important to understand the context, right?
Absolutely.
So this whole torture chamber thing, was there actually a room in Elizabeth's castle specifically for, torturing people?
Well, that's where the line between fact and fiction gets really blurry. Some accounts mention a torture chamber, but there's no real proof it actually existed.
So maybe not a secret dungeon filled with creepy devices. I guess that image fits a little too perfectly with the whole Blood Countess legend.
You got it. We have to be careful not to let the sensationalized stories overshadow the historical reality. Certain rooms in her castle might have been used for those purposes, but a dedicated torture chamber. No evidence of that.
Okay, that makes sense. But we know torture was, unfortunately, a common practice back then. What kinds of methods were used in 16th century Hungary?
We have records of all sorts of horrific devices. Whips, thumbscrews, and then there were the more elaborate contraptions, like the rack and the iron boot.
Oh, those sound terrifying.
They were. The iron boot, for example, was this metal device that enclosed the victim's foot. And then wedges were hammered in between the boot and the foot, crushing the bones.
Oh my gosh, that's just barbaric.
It's a grim reminder of how brutal things were back then, but it's important to understand that context. These practices, as horrific as they seem now, were considered normal, even legal at the time.
So even if some of the accusations against Elizabeth were true, she was still operating within a system that allowed for that kind of brutality. It doesn't excuse anything, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity to the story.
Absolutely. Judging historical figures solely through a modern lens isn't really fair, is it?
Right. We have to try and understand the social and legal norms of their time. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Elizabeth Báthory, what are some key takeaways? What do you hope our listeners will remember?
Well, I hope they come away with a better understanding of how history can be distorted, especially when it comes to stories about powerful women. The legend of Elizabeth Báthory is a perfect example of how speculation and sensationalism can cloud the truth.
And it's so important to be critical thinkers, right? To question the sources, consider different perspectives, and be wary of stories that sound too good or too gruesome to be true.
You said it. And lastly, it's good to remember that history is rarely black and white. Elizabeth Báthory, despite the terrible accusations against her, was a complex person who lived in a complex and often brutal time.
That's a great point. This deep dive has been fascinating and, honestly, pretty disturbing at times. We've looked at the historical context, the evidence, the myths.
Yeah.
It's definitely a story that'll stick with me.
It's a story that reminds us that there's always more to learn, more layers to peel back. That's what makes history so interesting. It's a never-ending exploration.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the past. It's been an eye-opening experience.
It was my pleasure. I'm always up for exploring history's mysteries.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive. Don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of history's most intriguing mysteries and controversies.